Welcome to everybody. My name is Stefan Jacobson. I come from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where we are also fostering transnational cooperation on wait a second. Oh, on disaster risk management issues. We have cooperated very closely, both with several of the countries and experts who are participating in the roundtable today, and with whom I have the pleasure to be moderating this session, including Bengt Sundelius, who has been on the advisory group of our high-level risk forum. We have also cooperated very closely with Austria, and we have the pleasure to have Florian Rudolf Miklau, head of the Torrent and Avalanche Control. We'll discuss what's happening in the Alps. We have also engaged with Hungary, and we have here an expert from the EU strategy from the Danube region, Mr. Kombas, and I'm also pleased to have the State Secretary in the Ministry of Environment and Spatial Planning in Slovenia. The question is, risk is a very diffuse issue. How do you get people to cooperate on managing risks? And this is the issue that brings us today. And of course, when there is an emergency, everyone will get together and will try to go and have some action. The question is, how can we think beyond the emergency, and how can we think upstream in other strategic ways to manage risks? One tool that the OECD has put forward on the table for many years is, for example, national risk assessment. And I take the opportunity to showcase this publication today. There are a lot of copies available outside, which brings together the results of 20 countries' efforts, many of whom supported by the European Commission in Europe, but also the United States, Australia, and Canada, on how countries do assess their risk, and how do you get a whole of government perspective on assessing risks, which is bringing all hazards approach, bringing all risks together, and trying to identify risk and improve awareness. The goal is also to bring the risk topic to the level of the heads of states, to the level of the office of the Prime Minister, so that you can give a helicopter view of all the risks portfolio facing the country in terms of likelihood and impact. The question is, how can we address transboundary risks with cascading effects? How can we understand and harmonize our understanding of risks and foster a common understanding? And based on this common and shared understanding, how can we strengthen capabilities? And the OECD, for example, in this project has brought 20 countries together to work and discuss over the years, based both on OECD guidance, the recommendation on the governance of critical risks, and European Union policy frameworks on national risk assessment. And I'm sure many of you are also aware of that. Some of the other ways that we brought countries together is through some of the more macro-regional focus studies, such as the ones that will be put forward for this meeting today. We also did a study, for example, with insights from France, Austria, and Switzerland, mostly alpine regions, looking at the range of alpine risks facing these countries with a detailed analysis of how you can manage investment in prevention in these regions. All these countries have made a lot of investments in the 60s and 70s during the years of high growth and face similar challenges in maintaining that stock of investment in infrastructure. Talking about the discussion today, so how can we sort of bring cooperation and promote risk awareness across borders? There are several examples, and if you look at water risks in Europe, for example, the Danube or the Rhine river basins are very large river basins across a range of European countries. The Rhine river basin has most of the economic powerhouse of Europe, including the sort of core European countries of the Netherlands, France, and Germany. The Danube river basin also brings together up to 10% of the population in Europe, with a very significant set of countries and cooperation arrangements. And I would want to also put this question in an economic perspective, because these are global value chains and business continuity that you have to preserve across these river basins. Has anyone thought about what would happen in Europe if the port of Rotterdam was to be blocked someday? It would be a European macro shock. And so the question is, how can we secure investments through cooperation in risk prevention and get countries together to think beyond their borders? And this is what the various speakers will tell us today. Of course, this works with water risks, and you also have regional basins, for example, in the Adriatic Sea in the south or in the Baltic Sea in the north, and Bengt Sundelius will talk to us about some of these regional initiatives. When you talk about seismic risk, I think the picture is a bit more complex because countries do not need to be geographically close together to cooperate. You saw, for example, the example earlier this afternoon that Italian experts are going to Mexico for rescue. I'm sure that if you look about seismic risks, countries such as Chile, Mexico, Italy, Japan have a lot to share in common with densely populated countries and very high exposure to seismic risks. Now, my pleasure is to introduce Angelo Masi, the professor of structural engineering in the University of Basilicata, for an initial presentation. Thank you.
I'm waiting for a presentation. Okay. Good afternoon. My presentation is on seismic risk prevention. And I talk about this risk because if it is not a transnational problem, it needs transnational solutions, transnational approach. As you know, risk is a function of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. As for hazard, recent research, such as that included in the SHORE project, confirms that the highest levels of seismic hazard concern countries such as Italy, Greece, Turkey, and Romania. However, moderate levels also cover certain areas of countries such as France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal. Hazard levels are related to earthquake history of countries. So, if on one hand, the stronger, in some cases devastating earthquakes hit mainly southern Europe, on the other hand, low and moderate earthquakes affected and can affect in the future also Central and Northern Europe, as the recent magnitude 4.2 event in the United Kingdom reminded us. Many buildings in Bristol were seriously damaged after this earthquake. With regard to the built heritage in Europe, the Building Performance Institute data shows that of the approximately 24 billion of square meters, more or less the surface of Belgium, of useful floor space in Europe, about 40% of this surface was built before 1960. So a very large number of buildings show signs of age and can require significant maintenance due to their structural conditions. Coming back to risk, a notable question is how much the impact of earthquakes, and especially how much the loss of human life, depends on their intensity. As a rule, as you can see in the diagram, the higher the earthquake magnitude, the heavier the impact. Really, looking at the historical data of the last century, this relationship appears rather weak. Of course, it should be considered that strong earthquakes near urban centers can kill a lot of people, and not at all when they occur in inhabited regions. However, when comparing earthquakes with a similar intensity, data highlights that far fewer fatalities occur in developed countries than in developing countries. As an example, the earthquake with magnitude 7.1 that hit New Zealand caused no deaths, whereas the M equal to 7.0 earthquake that hit Haiti killed more than 220,000 people. The main reason for this dramatic contrast concerns the different level of seismic vulnerability, as already explained my colleague and friend Agostino Goretti in the past talk, inspiring talk. So, different vulnerability in different countries can cause different impact, as well as different damage can be found in different buildings in an urban center. This is evident, dramatically evident, looking at the map of Onna, a small village near L'Aquila that was affected by the earthquake in 2009. A building completely collapsed, a building with low damage. A building with no damage can be found within a few meters. Vulnerability makes the difference, and earthquake is a pitiless judge. Even in areas considered to be of low or medium risk, medium intensity events can cause serious damage due to high vulnerability of affected buildings. The major role of vulnerability has been highlighted also during the last earthquake in Italy. Quite different damage distributions in areas and villages very close to each other have been found. To this end, it is very impressive, the comparison between the total destruction observed at Amatrice and the relatively low damage found at Norcia, where a wide strengthening program was carried out in the past years after previous seismic events. It is worth noting that beyond the collapse of older masonry buildings, in some ways expected, also the collapse of more recent reinforced concrete buildings was observed, as in the case of this building in Amatrice, that before the earthquake certainly did not appear highly vulnerable at the visual inspection, but that caused very heavy consequences. So we need to learn more and more from past earthquakes. As a full-scale laboratory, the place of a damaging earthquake provide important lessons. But are the lessons suitably identified and consequently learned? Further, are the lessons put in practice, and how? That is, are they disseminated? And finally, are they properly applied? These are crucial questions, especially if we look at the dramatic effects that earthquakes still cause around the world, frequently despite their low intensity. The recent report of the European Commission on the interim evaluation of the civil protection mechanism, beyond reaffirming the importance of knowledge sharing, underlines that there needs to be a continuous feedback loop between lessons learned and the implementation of prevention and not only prevention activities. Better exploitation of the lessons learned process, as an example by improving transnational exchange, transnational cooperation, is required to reduce the gap between what is learned and what is applied. In the light of the foregoing considerations, seismic risk prevention is a primary requirement for Europe in order to protect the safety of its citizens, conserve its historical heritage, and maintain the conditions for territorial development and cohesion. In this context, the opinion, a European policy on the seismic requalification of buildings and infrastructure was developed at the European Committee of the Regions. The opinion that was approved at the plenary session of October 2017 points out some important steps to concretely carry out a wide requalification program in European countries based on a sustainable and integrated approach, also dealing with energy efficiency and not only with seismic requalification. The crucial point of the opinion is proposing that the seismic risk, and by analogy other natural risks affecting a territory, should be considered as an additional factor when allocating, when distributing the European structural and investment funds, in view, of course, of the next program, 2021-2027. Acknowledging that risk levels have to be assessed according to well-defined criteria, the opinion asks for uniform assessment procedures throughout Europe to give comparable results, thus guaranteeing a correct distribution among European countries and regions in the possible allocation of ESI funds. To this end, as well as to define other important steps of the requalification program, the opinion calls on the European Commission to issue an action plan on the seismic requalification of existing buildings as a priority in the regional development operational program of member states. Well, I'm about to finish my presentation. As already said, beyond learning from earthquakes, we need to disseminate the lessons and, above all, apply them. Crucial is the role of the citizens. Every citizen, each citizen. To this regard, I cannot fail to mention the best practice of public communication aimed at fostering the culture of prevention. That is the campaign I Do Not Take Risks that takes place in Italy since 2011. It was created and promoted by the Italian Department of Civil Protection, the National Assistance for Public, the National Association for Public Assistance, representing the voluntary sector, the Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, and the network of the University Laboratories of Seismic Engineering, representing the scientific community. The campaign was purposely designed to transfer information on risk mitigation to common people, with the main objective of enhancing the self-protection capability. Being targeted to ordinary citizens, the campaign is carried out where the citizen can be met. That is in the squares of the towns where they live and work. Up to 16,000 of civil protection volunteers, which are the main actors of this campaign, have been trained. In turn, trained volunteers informed about 2 million of citizens in several hundreds of Italian towns. In the first edition, only on seismic risk, and since 2014, also on tsunami and flood risk. The experience of the first years of the campaign confirms that risk communication and awareness are crucial to building social capacity and to help citizens effectively cope with the natural hazards, being informed, aware, and finally active. Citizens that need to live prevention as a right, but also, and this is more difficult, a little bit more difficult, as a duty. The campaign is due to the work of quite a lot of people, and I wish to thank all of them for their passion and, above all, for the example they set. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Masi. Now I turn to Bengt Sundelius to provide an overview of the successful macro-regional cooperation in the Baltic Sea region. Bengt is a strategic advisor to the Director General of MSB, the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency.
Much. We will get some slides coming up here. Yes, thank you. And